friends, and welcome back to For the Joy, a podcast where we hold the tension between life's hard and life's hope. I'm Bethany, your host, and I'm so grateful you're here. This is a space for real conversations about grief, trauma, freedom, joy, and everything in between. Together, we'll explore what it means to live as whole, integrated people, body, soul, and spirit, while also navigating the challenges of life and walking in the freedom and hope we have in Christ. Whether you're feeling strong in your faith, struggling to hold on, or stepping into belief for the very first time, this is a place where you can come as you are. Let's grow together, learn together, and find joy in the journey. Thank you for being here. Today, we're diving back into the verse that inspired the heart of this podcast, Hebrews 12:2. If you are catching the series for the first time, I encourage you to go back and listen to the previous episodes after you finish this one. So back to Hebrews 12:2. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. This verse captures something so profound and tender. The reality that Jesus, fully man and fully God, endured the suffering of the cross with joy before him, and shame behind him, under and around him. Shame. It's more than just a feeling. It's a force that shapes how we see ourselves, how we relate to others, and even how we approach God. It whispers lies about our worth, keeping us stuck in cycles of hiding, performing, or proving ourselves. But where did shame come from? Why does it hold such power over us? And why did Jesus scorn it? From the very beginning, shame entered the world as a result of sin. When Adam and Eve disobeyed, their first instinct was to cover themselves and hide. That's what shame does. It isolates, silences, and convinces us that who we are is not enough. It distorts our identity and separates us from ourselves, others, and from the fullness of life God intends for us. But Jesus, he did something radical with shame. Instead of avoiding it, he faced it head on. Hebrews 12:2 says that Jesus endured the cross, scorning its shame. That word scorn means he looked shame in the face and rendered it powerless. The very thing that was meant to humiliate and degrade him, he disregarded. Why? Because he saw the joy set before him, the joy of redeeming us, you, me, of restoring what shame had stolen. Today, shame is the focus of our episode. We're going to talk about what it is, how it affects the way we live, and what it looks like to walk in the freedom Jesus secured for us. If shame has ever silenced you, made you question your worth, or kept you from stepping into the fullness of who God created you to be, this conversation is for you. Let's start where shame first entered humanity's story, back to the beginning, back to the Garden of Eden. In Genesis 1 and 2, we see the beauty of God's creation and his abundant provision for humanity. God created us in his image, blessing us with purpose and authority to fill and care for the earth. He provided every seed-bearing plant and tree for food, planting humanity in a garden where every need was met. At the heart of the garden were two trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God gave one command: freedom to eat from any tree except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God warned that eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil would bring death. These trees symbolized a profound choice: life or death. This story reminds us that God's commands are not just rules. They invite us into life and intimacy with him. It connects the truth of God's word, his creation, provision, and commands with a personal experience of trusting his goodness and choosing life in him. Reminder from a previous episode that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. We discussed last week the meaning of the word obey. It means to listen with intention, understanding, and response. It's a deep relational kind of hearing, the kind that leads to knowing, trusting, and aligning ourselves with God. God gave us a command to eat from any tree except the tree that brought death. And in this garden, something beautiful existed. They felt no shame. Let's pause here and think about this life with no shame. What would it feel like to live without the weight of judgment, the need to hide, or the fear of not being enough? Before sin and shame and humanity lived in unbroken connection with God, with creation, and with each other. It was a life of pure joy, wholeheartedness, and peace. It's almost impossible to grasp what that actually means on this side of the garden. So let me attempt to paint a picture for you. Before Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, life was like being in the calmest, most peaceful part of the ocean, an untouched paradise. Imagine being surrounded by clear, warm waters where everything feels perfectly in peace. The sea is still, reflecting the beauty of the sky above, and you're floating in a perfect harmony, effortlessly moving with the gentle waves. There's a rhythm to life, like the ebb and flow of the tide, where everything is connected, peaceful, and there's no struggle. No fear, no separation from what's good. In this peaceful ocean, there's perfect unity between Adam, Eve, and God. The waters are calm, untouched by any storm, free from turbulence or disruption. Their relationship with God was as natural as breathing, with no shame, no confusion, just pure trust and joy in his presence. There was no need to understand right or wrong, good or evil. There was simply the beauty of being in relationship with God, fully dependent on his goodness. Adam and Eve were given free rein to be fruitful, increase, fill the earth, and subdue it with no shame. The only command they were given was to not eat from one tree. God did not want them to experience death. This command was a protection. 2 trees were named in Genesis, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. One tree brought life, and the other tree brought death. Did they know what death was? They didn't know what it was like to live in shame. They only lived fully exposed, physically, mentally, and spiritually, body, soul, and spirit, with the Lord in unbroken connection and relationship. They walked naked with God. This scene in the Garden of Eden is the definition of intimacy with God, relying fully on his provisions, obeying his commands, and enjoying his blessings with no shame. But then, the enemy entered the scene. Satan brought doubt, temptation, and a desire for something outside of what God had given, outside of his commands, and outside of his blessings. Satan tempted Eve in Genesis 3:1 with the question, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" Eve entertained this question of doubt with the truth of God's command and responded, "We may eat from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die." Satan's seed of doubt continues with, "You will surely not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. There is a whole lot to unpack here, but that's for another time. I encourage you to take the time to read the first 3 chapters of Genesis. So, when Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree, their perspective immediately shifted. Their eyes opened, and what they didn't know before, they knew something of now. They realized their nakedness, covered themselves, and hid from God. When sin entered the world, Adam and Eve hid. Shame, doubt, and the ache of separation crept in, whispering the questions, are we still loved? Are we still enough? The painful reality is that sin fractured what was once whole. On their own, they could no longer stand righteous before a holy God. His perfection and their brokenness could not dwell together. But in His mercy, God did not turn away or leave them in their shame. Instead, He provided a covering, first through the sacrifice of an animal, and ultimately through the sacrifice of His Son. What sin destroyed, His love made a way to restore. So going back to the ocean analogy, shame is like a sudden wave crashing onto a stilled sea. The moment they ate from the tree, everything shifted. It was as if the ocean's calm was disrupted by a storm. The clarity of the water became murky, and they no longer could float peacefully. They had stepped into the knowledge of good and evil, and with it came the weight of pride, shame, rebellion, fear, and unbelief. A separation from the peace they once knew. The calm waters turned turbulent, and now the journey through life would require navigating through those waves. Just like that ocean before the storm, our lives were once meant to flow in harmony with God's design, with no need to question, no need to fear, just simply to exist in His love and goodness. But the moment they ate from the tree, they experienced the full force of the storm, shifting tides, crashing waves, and the weight of the knowledge that was never meant to be ours to carry. The taste of the knowledge of good and evil brought death. It wasn't an immediate physical death, but rather a profound spiritual and relational death. It was a death to intimacy, innocence, and the unbroken connection they had with God, with each other, and with creation. They were like a thriving vine suddenly severed from its source. Though still green for a time, the process of decay had already begun, a slow, inevitable death. What was once vibrant, whole, and flourishing became broken, fragmented, and bound to the cycle of decay. Their nature, once alive in perfect union with God, was now subject to death because of sin. Yet even in this decay, hope remains. Hope of redemption, when our bodies will be freed from decay and restored to glory. For in this hope we were saved. We will explore more of this in a future episode, but for now, let's go back to the cross. So that same shame experienced in the Garden of Eden and we experience today is what Jesus despised and scorned as He endured the cross. Jesus had you in mind at the cross. He hates the shame of your story. And for the joy set before Him, He endured death on a cross. One of my 2 favorite definitions of shame comes from Brené Brown. Brené Brown is a renowned research professor, author, and speaker whose work focuses on vulnerability, courage, shame, and empathy. With over 2 decades of research, she has become a trusted voice in helping people understand and navigate emotions that often feel overwhelming or isolating. Her definition of shame cuts through the complexity of this emotion with clarity and compassion. She defines shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. While Brene offers a clear and compassionate understanding of shame, Dan Allender takes us deeper into its spiritual and emotional impact. He is a respected author, psychologist, and professor whose work explores the intersection of faith, trauma, and emotional healing. In The Cry of the Soul, Allender offers a profound perspective on shame, defining it as an acid that strips us of our dignity and dissolves hope. No other emotion better portrays hell, the utter loss of intimacy, wonder, and joy. Shame attacks identity, and the experience of it feels like a prolonged, torturous death. Both perspectives highlight the destructive power of shame, but Allender's approach invites us to see how this painful emotion can also be a pathway to deeper dependence on God's grace and redemption. If you've ever felt the weight of shame, I encourage you to explore The Cry of the Soul. It is a life-changing book that sheds light on how shame can bind us in fear or lead us into God's transformative love. Shame. Can you relate to that sense of being deeply flawed, unworthy, and disconnected from love, intimacy, and hope? Are you able to feel the weight of the before and after in the Garden of Eden? Adam and Eve walking naked in the garden to covering themselves with fig leaves after the bite of the knowledge of good and evil. The mere sound of the Lord walking in the garden, and they hid. God called to them, "Where are you?" Adam replied, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." Fear and shame, fear of being in the presence of the Creator. Have you ever felt God call to you, but out of fear and shame, you hid? Shame doesn't just weigh us down, it shapes us. It seeps into the way we see ourselves, how we relate to others, and even how we believe God sees us. It whispers lies about our worth and keeps us trapped in silence. For me, shame entered my story very early in life, in a dark basement and against my will. It wasn't just something I felt, it became a lens through which I saw myself, a heavy burden I carried without realizing how much it was shaping me. A moment that marked me, where I no longer wanted to be seen, where my dignity was stripped, my identity attacked, and the torturous death that shame causes began. I learned to hide, and hiding became my way of coping with the deep roots of unworthiness of love and belonging. We all have entry points for shame in our stories, moments that leave us feeling exposed, unloved, and unworthy. Some of these moments were chosen for us, and others were the result of choices we made. Shame can often feel like an old, tattered coat, one you didn't choose, but somehow found draped over your shoulders. At first, you barely noticed. It felt like it belonged, even though it didn't quite fit right. Over time, the weight of it grew heavier, the fabric rough and scratchy, rubbing against your skin and leaving invisible marks. Sometimes it clings to you like a second skin, so woven into your being that you forget it's even there. Other times, it feels like a suffocating fog, clouding your vision and making it hard to move forward. Maybe your shame feels like chains, cold, unyielding, and loud enough to drown out hope. Or like a mask you've worn so long, you don't even remember what it feels like without. Shame sneaks into the corners of our minds, whispering lies. You're not enough. You'll never belong. If they knew the truth about you, they'd turn away. My personal shadow script of shame was, who do you think you are? And what difference does it make? This unrelenting lie kept me hidden, small, and doubting my worth for years. Shame literally became the filter through which I saw myself, distorting even the most beautiful truths. Last week, I shared the powerful verses in Psalm 139 and how I had heard the words, I was fearfully and wonderfully made, that God had knit me together with care before I even took my first breath. And yet, I couldn't believe it, that it even applied to me. I wanted to. I longed to believe the same hands that formed me still reached for me, that the same eyes that saw my unformed body still looked at me with love. But shame whispered otherwise. It told me I had wandered too far, that my choices had redefined me, that I was no longer worthy of his tenderness. And so, the silence of shame settled in, its voice growing louder with every decision, big and small. You don't deserve that. Who do you think you are? Keep it all inside. No one wants to hear how you truly feel. If they do, they'll leave. It shaped how I moved through the world, how I saw myself, how I let myself be seen. Shame convinced me that hiding was safer than being known. Have you ever felt the quiet pull of shame shaping the way you see yourself, the decisions you make, the words you hold back, the parts of you that feel too risky to be known? Shame doesn't just weigh us down, it binds and silences. It whispers that we are unworthy, that our voices don't matter, that if anyone truly knew, they would turn away. I know this silence well. It wasn't just a passing feeling, it became a prison, a place where I felt trapped, unseen, and unheard. Shame didn't just quiet me, it froze me. It kept me from stepping forward, from speaking truth, from believing I was worth being known. It convinced me that hiding was safer than being seen, that silence was better than risking rejection. But shame is a liar, and while it silences, God calls. It speaks into the very places where shame tells us to shrink back, offering truth that breaks chains and light that drives out the darkness. Shame wraps itself around your identity, making it harder to remember who you truly are, created in the image of God, deeply loved and full of purpose, and that you are not a problem to be solved, but a treasure to discover. And yet shame is not meant to stay. Jesus invites us to lay it down, to let him remove it piece by piece, coats, chains, masks, and all. And here's the hope. It's for this shame that Christ endured the cross. Jesus took on the shame and loss of dignity that entered humanity in the garden. He took on your shame. He heard your shadow script of shame before you were even born. He drank the cup of wrath meant for all mankind, endured a torturous death, and spent 3 days in the grave. He did this so that we could be restored, not just forgiven, but also freed from our shame. He invites us to step out of hiding and into intimacy with him. For me, freedom has been a long, arduous journey. And my first taste of it came when I allowed someone to hold my story with genuine care and empathy. In that sacred space, I named the lies I had believed, grieved the pain they caused, and endured the cross of facing my shame. It was there in the honest, messy, embodied work of bringing my hidden places into the light that I began to truly understand the joy and freedom Christ offers. Shame just doesn't live in my thoughts. It takes up space in my body. When it rises, I feel the weight of it in my chest, the tension in my shoulders, and the instinct to shut down, to hide, and to disappear. But I'm learning to listen to those signals, not as a reason to retreat, but as an invitation to tend to what's wounded. When shame creeps into my thoughts, I capture the lies and realign them with truth. When it stirs up humiliation, anger, or defensiveness, I recognize that it's trying to protect me, but at the cost of the intimacy, wonder, and joy God longs for me to walk in. The antidote to shame is vulnerability, met with empathy. We heal when our stories are held with honor, not dismissed, not minimized, but truly seen. This is the very heart of Christ, who not only bore our shame, but meets us in it, offering us a love so steady and true that we no longer have to hide. This podcast, this ministry, it is the redemption of my shame story. I have always felt called to speak, teach, coach, yet even saying those words felt impossible. Why would God call me? What did that even mean? I had a passion for God's word, but for years I studied it in silence, keeping it to myself. I felt the nudge to share, had opportunities along the way, yet every time I was quickly silenced, shut down, consumed, and used. The journey has been painful, but in His grace, God placed people in my life, safe people who held me, encouraged me, saw me, and accepted me as I was. Trust me, I fought them. I tested them. I ran. But they stayed. And little by little, as I learned safety with others, I began to experience safety within myself and ultimately with God. Then came the breaking and the awakening. The pain and grief of my mother's death was the beginning of the end of my shame story. In the 3 weeks of her illness and the long, dark year of grief that followed, I witnessed and experienced God in a way that changed me. That season shattered me and at the same time called me to rise. It was there that I finally said yes. Yes to freedom. Yes to the truths I had spent my entire life fighting. I became honest, vulnerable, real, unashamed. And it's excruciatingly beautiful. This work of healing, of stepping into freedom, it is work. But it is work I love. Because for the joy set before me is you. Every listener, every person God brings to this space in my life. You are why I say yes. And I invite you to say yes too. So will you join me on this journey of freedom? So what about your story? Do you know the shadow script that keeps you hidden and silenced? I want to gently ask you, where did shame first enter your story? Be curious and kind to yourself. Jesus despised it for you so that you could walk in freedom and joy. I would be honored to sit with you, to hear and hold your story with tender care and offer a taste of freedom. Friend, shame wants to keep us hiding, but God calls us into His light, fully seen, fully known, and fully loved. As we close, I encourage you to spend time reading Genesis 1 through 3 and reflecting on Hebrews 12, 1 through 2. Take a moment to consider this question. What was the joy set before Jesus? Thank you for being here today and for allowing me to walk alongside you in this journey. Until next time, remember, you are deeply loved, completely accepted, and called to live in the freedom and joy of Christ. Be encouraged, be strengthened, and be filled with the joy that comes from living fully alive in Christ. You are made for this abundant life, and it's waiting for you right here, right now in Him. Until next time, may His grace guide you, His love sustain you, and His joy overflow in every part of your life. If you would like to book a free discovery call with me or sign up to receive my free 5-day program From Overwhelmed to Empowered, head over to my website at BethanyJoyMinistry.com or follow me on all socials. Thanks, and see you soon.